Hi, I'm Jay Tyler. In this video, I'm going to be talking about things that need to be considered before sending impressions and models to the laboratory for appliance fabrication, whether it's an in-office lab or a commercial lab. Now, many years ago, I used to be a chairside assistant, and I also worked in the in-office lab at that office. So I've been involved in the impression process, the model pouring, and the appliance fabrication. Now, if you're a seasoned chairside assistant, this video is probably going to be a little remedial for you. But if you're new, hopefully I'll be sharing some tips that will help prevent having to get the patient back in again for a new impression because something went wrong. Let's start with impressions. This is an alternate impression that was taken, and a couple of the issues that I see is that they're not poured soon enough, and you get warpage, which is ends up with a misrepresentation of the anatomy. Different materials have different setup times or different times in which you can pour them up. Some are hours and some are just minutes before they need to be poured up. But either way, I like to keep them wrapped in a wet paper towel and in a Ziploc baggie until they're poured. Another type of impression that is typical that we see is the hard-bodied impression. Now, this usually has two materials. It has one material that has the characteristic of really highly defining the anatomy. As you can see here, you can really tell where the gingival margin is. It's a very good impression. But it's usually very expensive, so they'll have that attached to a hard body, another hard body material that's less expensive that provides the bulk of it. So some of the problems I've seen with this is that where the two materials come together, there might be a separation, a little bit of separation. If you're doing something that requires detail in the occlusal surface, that could be a problem, like a night guard or something like that. So examine that once you take the impression and remove it. Another thing I've seen with these hard-bodied impressions is sometimes maybe the patient will wiggle around or something, or maybe it's taken out of the mouth before it fully sets, and you'll see these areas where it pulls away. I don't see any of them here, but sometimes it'll have little distortions and pull-aways. So you can examine these impressions while the patient is still there, and if it's got a problem, then you can retake it. Another problem is make sure if it's going to be like a wraparound retainer going to be made, that you have the distal of the second molars identified. And if you need a full palatal representation for like a full palatal hollow retainer or something like that, you got to have the full palate. You got to have this. You can't be having that. So the best I could do here with the retainer would be make a horseshoe design. If the doctor wanted a full palate, this impression would not work. Like I say, the bottom line is while the patient is still there, examine it, check to see what the appliance is going to be, make sure you have everything represented in order to be able to make that appliance. Now, when you pour the impression up, usually the patient's gone by then, so it's a different deal. Some offices will have the patient wait until they examine the model, and that's really best. So if it's not good, then you can retake the impression. A lot of offices don't do that though. So this is the model that I made with this impression. So if I poured it up again, this would be a second pour, but this is the first pour. And this is a pretty good model. There's no bubbles that are noticeable. It's got good representation of the palate. It's got, you can see the mucobuccal fold down in the vestibule. You can see the frenum attachments. It's got just about everything you need. So you can make practically anything with this. And the thickness, once I trim this up, is going to be adequate to do just about anything I want. Now sometimes if the models are say thin like this, maybe it gets dropped or something and it breaks. I've seen models come in that are broken and super glued together, and maybe they don't get it back together real well. In all honesty, if it breaks, I would rather get the two pieces and put it to get back together myself. But if you're going to do this, make certain that it goes accurately back together, because if it's just the least bit off, it depends on what kind of appliance you're going to be making. It may not work at all. If you're pouring these up and you separate it and you see a lot of bubbles, that could be an issue, depending again on what the appliance is going to be. If it's like an Essex retainer, you need to do something with these bubbles. If you have a whole lot of bubbles, you probably need to take the impression again. Now, a lot of doctors, a lot of offices will fill these in, and I've seen it real often where they put composite material in there and they'll light cure it. Well, that becomes real hard and it's hard to trim and mold and deal with. I would rather, as a lab guy, have the model with the bubbles and everything sent to me, and I'll fill those in, and I'll fill them in with wax, and with the wax I can carve it and make it be congruent with the rest of the anatomy that it's adjacent to. Okay, so if you trim these models yourself, you could trim them too close, trim the bases down too much, and they become too thin. And if that's the case, then what the lab has to do is put another base on it. We have to mix another round of plaster, put undercut in the existing plaster, and create a thicker base. Like if you're going to cut the teeth off and do an anterior setup or something like that, which wouldn't be the case in something like this, or if you're going to be putting bands on and cutting the teeth back here, which is probably the reason this was rebased, then if you cut it here to put a band on, then it's too thin. So there's lots of reasons why you'd have to rebase it. So make sure you got enough base for the lab to work with. Now if it's going to be for like an Essex retainer, it's okay to leave it thin. Another thing, if you're trimming the base, if you go too deep like this one was on an upper, you can expose the palate. Now if the lab needed this anatomy to make something like a full palatal coverage, then it's going to be a bit of an issue. If you're going to make like an Essex retainer, that's not an issue at all. In fact, you'd probably cut this down even farther, and that hole would even be bigger. Another thing with trimming is, see how this was trimmed right here? You can see a trim mark right here. Well, that takes away from the anatomy somewhat. You can't really tell where that contour is that goes down toward the mucobuccal fold. So if you do a labial bow, it's going to be a little bit of a guess game there. That's not the case over here. I've seen incisors nicked with the model trimming wheel, and depending again on what you're making, that could be a real issue. More often than not, I've seen where the second molars are whacked off and a wraparound retainer is wanted. So just be real mindful of what type of appliance is being made when you're pouring and trimming these models, if you trim them indeed, and that everything will be represented on the model for the appliance that needs to be made. Okay, I'm sure there's a lot of other things out there that I hadn't thought of. If so, please put those down in the comments. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next week.